This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I'd made this walk hundreds of times before, but something felt off that night. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. I quickened my pace slightly, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it, footsteps behind me, matching my rhythm exactly. I glanced back over my shoulder, trying to be casual about it. About half a block back, I saw a figure in a dark hoodie, head down, walking in the same direction. Okay, no big deal, I thought. Probably just someone else heading home after a late night. But the prickling sensation of unease wouldn't leave me. I decided to test my suspicion. At the next intersection, instead of continuing straight as usual, I made a sharp right turn. The footsteps behind me hesitated for just a moment, then followed. My heart started to pound. This was no coincidence. I was being followed. I picked up my pace, power walking now. The footsteps behind me quickened to match. I made another turn, this time left, deviating further from my usual route home. Again, the follower mirrored my movements. Panic started to set in. Who was this person? What did they want? I'm not a small guy. I'm 6'2" and work out regularly. But the thought of confronting this shadow in the night filled me with dread. I spotted a 24-hour convenience store up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon of safety. I hurried inside, the bell above the door jingling as I entered. The bored-looking clerk barely glanced up from his phone. I pretended to browse the snack aisle while watching the door. After a minute, I saw the hooded figure pass by slowly, peering inside. My blood ran cold as I caught a glimpse of their face in the glow of the storefront. Pale, gaunt features and dark, sunken eyes. They locked eyes with me for just a moment before continuing past. I waited another 5 minutes in the store, my heart hammering in my chest. When I cautiously stepped back outside, the street appeared empty. Had they given up? I power walked the last few blocks to my apartment building, constantly looking over my shoulder. Just as I reached for the door, movement in my peripheral vision made me whirl around. The hooded figure was across the street, standing perfectly still, staring directly at me. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I slammed it behind me and ran up the 4 flights of stairs to my unit, not wanting to wait for the elevator. Once inside, I locked and chained the door, then sank to the floor, gasping for breath. What the hell had just happened? Who was that person? And why were they following me? I crawled over to the window and peeked out through the blinds. The hooded figure was gone. Had I imagined the whole thing? I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the events in my mind, second-guessing every detail. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe I was overreacting to nothing. But deep down, I knew what I'd experienced was real. The methodical way they'd followed my every move. That haunting face in the convenience store window. The final image of them standing across from my building, watching. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face going outside. I spent the day huddled in my apartment, jumping at every little noise. That evening, my curiosity finally overcame my fear. I had to know if they were still out there. I crept to the window and peered out. My heart nearly stopped. There, on the opposite sidewalk, stood the hooded figure, waiting, watching. I scrambled away from the window in horror. This couldn't be happening. Why me? What did this person want? I called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless the person actually tried to break in or attack me. Following someone on public streets wasn't technically illegal. For the next week, I only left my apartment when absolutely necessary. Each time, no matter what hour I went out, I'd spot the hooded figure, sometimes across the street, sometimes half a block behind. Always watching, always following. I became a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep. I barely ate. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. I tried changing up my schedule, leaving at different times. It didn't matter. They were always there. I even tried taking a taxi to throw them off. But when I got out at my destination, there they were, waiting. How were they doing this? It was like they could predict my movements before I even made them. After 2 weeks of this psychological torture, I'd had enough. I decided to confront my stalker. The next time I left my building and spotted them, I marched directly across the street towards them. They didn't move or try to run. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The dark circles under their eyes, the sallow, almost grayish skin, the blank, emotionless stare. "Who are you?" I demanded. "Why are you following me?" They said nothing, just continued to stare. "Answer me," I shouted, grabbing the front of their hoodie. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Up close, I could see that their eyes weren't just dark, they were completely black. No whites, no irises, just endless, bottomless black. I stumbled backward in shock. The hooded figure's mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, door locked and barricaded with a chair. What was that thing? It couldn't be human. The eyes, the teeth. It was like something out of a nightmare. I spent the next 3 days holed up in my apartment, not daring to so much as look out the window. I was afraid of what I might see. On the 4th day, when I finally worked up the courage to peer outside, the street was empty. No hooded figure, no one watching. I waited another day, then cautiously ventured out. Nothing. No sign of my stalker. It's been a month now, and I haven't seen them since. But I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting, watching. I don't know what that thing was or what it wanted. I don't know why it chose me or why it suddenly stopped. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget those black eyes and those razor-sharp teeth. Sometimes at night, I still hear phantom footsteps echoing my own. And every time I leave my apartment, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that hooded figure following me once again. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in this city again. The experience has left me permanently on edge, always watching, always waiting for those footsteps to return. If you're reading this, be careful out there. You never know who or what might be following you in the shadows. And if you ever find yourself being stalked by a figure in a dark hoodie, don't confront them. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because what's under that hood might be far worse than anything you could imagine. I was so excited when we first moved into our new house in the suburbs. After years of cramped apartment living, it felt like a dream come true to have a spacious home with a big backyard for our daughter Lily to play in. The neighborhood seemed picture-perfect too, quiet streets lined with well-kept homes, friendly faces waving as they walked their dogs or mowed their lawns. Everything was going great for the first few weeks. We were settling in nicely, unpacking boxes and starting to make the place feel like home. Lily was thrilled to have her own room to decorate, and my husband and I loved having a proper kitchen to cook in. The neighbors all seemed welcoming, stopping by to introduce themselves and bring over baked goods or small housewarming gifts. That's how we first met Chris, who lived in the house next door with his wife. He seemed nice enough at first, a bit loud and boisterous maybe, but friendly. He came over one Saturday afternoon as we were doing yard work, introducing himself and chatting for a while. I remember thinking he was a little overly familiar for someone we'd just met, standing a bit too close and making lots of intense eye contact. But I brushed it off as just an outgoing personality. It wasn't until a couple weeks later that things started to feel off. I was scrolling through Facebook one evening when I got a friend request from Chris. I thought it was a little odd to friend request your new neighbors online, but figured it was harmless enough and accepted. Almost immediately, he started liking and commenting on nearly all of my posts, especially any photos I shared of Lily. The comments weren't overtly inappropriate, just things like, "What a cutie," or "She's getting so big," but the sheer volume felt unsettling. Around the same time, I started noticing Chris outside a lot more when Lily was playing in the yard after school. He always seemed to have a reason to be out front, checking the mail, washing his car, doing yard work, and he'd always make a point of calling out to say hi and try to strike up a conversation, asking Lily lots of questions about school and her friends. It made me uneasy, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Then one day, Lily came inside looking uncomfortable. When I asked what was wrong, she said Chris had been talking to her over the fence and made a comment about how pretty she was getting and how she'd be breaking boys' hearts soon. She was only 11 at the time. A chill ran down my spine hearing that, but I didn't want to scare Lily, so I just told her to come inside if Chris ever made her feel weird again. I mentioned it to my husband that night, and he agreed it was concerning. We decided to start limiting Lily's time playing outside unsupervised, but things only escalated from there. Chris seemed to always know when Lily got home from school, and would coincidentally be outside at the same time. He started offering her rides home if he saw her walking down the street. Thankfully, she always refused, but it was clear he was going out of his way to interact with her. The final straw came about a month after we'd moved in. I was cleaning up after dinner one night when I glanced out the kitchen window and saw a shadowy figure near Lily's bedroom window. My heart nearly stopped. I ran outside and found Chris standing there, claiming he'd seen a suspicious person and was just checking things out. But I knew he'd been trying to look in my daughter's window. Shaken and furious, I told Chris to leave immediately and stay away from our family. My husband and I spent a sleepless night discussing what to do. The next morning, we went to the police station to file a report. And that's when we found out the truth about our neighbor. It turned out Chris had a violent criminal record, including assault charges and a restraining order from an ex-girlfriend. He was a registered sex offender who wasn't supposed to be living within a certain distance of schools or playgrounds. Somehow he'd slipped through the cracks when moving to our neighborhood. The police took our concerns seriously and launched an investigation. In the process, they discovered Chris had been carrying on an affair, and his wife kicked him out when she found out. He'd been staying with a friend in another part of town for the past week, which explained why we hadn't seen him lately. Chris was ultimately arrested for violating the terms of his sex offender registration. Last I heard, he was facing jail time. His wife put their house up for sale and moved away. I'm so grateful nothing worse happened, but I still have nightmares about what could have been. We've since installed security cameras, and I'm much more cautious about who I let into our lives. Lily seems okay, but she's in therapy to process everything. I can't help but think about how easily this predator wormed his way into our neighborhood, how close he came to potentially harming my child. It's a parent's worst nightmare. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Trust your instincts, be vigilant, and never assume you really know someone just because they seem friendly. Evil can hide behind a charming smile and a well-kept lawn. Stay safe out there. I was just trying to put myself out there, you know. After a string of failed relationships and feeling lonely, I decided to give online dating a shot. Little did I know that swiping right on that seemingly normal profile would lead to weeks of harassment and fear. It all started innocently enough. I matched with this guy, let's call him Mark, on a popular dating app. His profile seemed decent, nice photos, witty bio, similar interests. We started chatting, and he came across as funny and charming at first. After a few days of messaging back and forth, he suggested we meet up for coffee. I was hesitant, but figured a quick coffee date in a public place would be safe enough. We met at a local cafe on a Saturday afternoon. In person, Mark was reasonably attractive, and initially seemed nice, if a bit intense. He asked a lot of questions about my life, job, family, etc. Looking back, I probably shared more personal details than I should have with a virtual stranger. The date itself was fine, but nothing special. I didn't feel any real spark or connection. When he suggested meeting up again soon, I politely declined and said I didn't think we were a good match. That's when things started to get weird. Over the next few days, Mark bombarded me with messages. At first they were just pushy, asking why I didn't want to see him again, insisting we should give it another shot. I reiterated that I wasn't interested, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. The messages got increasingly frequent and aggressive in tone. Then came the inappropriate photos. I was at a family dinner when my phone buzzed. I discreetly checked it under the table, only to be greeted by an unsolicited explicit pic from Mark. I was mortified and quickly put my phone away, trying to hide my shock from my relatives. But the buzzing continued as he sent message after message. I excused myself to the bathroom and blocked his number, hoping that would be the end of it. But he just created new profiles to contact me from. At this point, I was getting seriously creeped out. I considered reporting him to the dating app, but worried about potential retaliation. A few days later, I was home alone watching TV when I got a message from an unknown number. Nice apartment complex. The blue door looks good. My blood ran cold. How did he know where I lived? I peeked out the window and saw a shadowy figure standing across the street, staring up at my building. Panicking, I called a friend to come over immediately. As I waited for her to arrive, more messages came through. I can see your bedroom light on. Why won't you talk to me? Come outside, I just want to chat. I was shaking uncontrollably, terrified he would try to break in. My friend arrived about 20 minutes later and insisted on calling the police. When they showed up, the guy was gone. The officers took a report, but said there wasn't much they could do since he hadn't actually done anything illegal. They suggested I stay with someone else for a few days, which I did. But even at my friend's place, the harassment continued online. Mark had somehow found all my social media profiles. He left creepy comments on old photos and posts. He seemed to know details about my life and schedule that I had never told him. Had he been stalking me online this whole time? I deactivated all my accounts and changed my phone number, but still felt on edge constantly. Every time I left the house, I was terrified I'd run into him. I started having nightmares about being followed and attacked. My work suffered as I struggled to focus through the stress and lack of sleep. After a couple weeks of radio silence, I started to think maybe it was finally over. I cautiously reactivated one social media account, thinking I was being paranoid. Big mistake. Within hours, Mark had found me again. This time, the messages were even more unhinged and threatening. He said things like, "You can't hide from me. We belong together and I'll make you see that. If I can't have you, no one will." I was genuinely afraid for my safety at this point. I went back to the police, but they still said their hands were tied without concrete evidence of a crime. I felt utterly helpless. This psycho knew where I lived, worked, hung out. He had access to so much of my personal information. I started researching how to completely erase my digital footprint, but it seemed impossible in this interconnected world. The final straw came about a month after our initial coffee date. I was walking to my car after work when I noticed something stuck under the windshield wiper. It was a handwritten note that said, "Soon." Just that one ominous word. I looked around frantically but didn't see anyone watching. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up some essentials and fled to stay with family in another state. I told my job I needed a leave of absence for a family emergency. I was too ashamed and scared to tell many people what was really going on. It's been a few months now, and things seem to have died down. But I'm still constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every notification on my phone. I'm seeing a therapist to work through the trauma and anxiety. I've installed security cameras at my new place and rarely go out alone anymore. The whole ordeal has completely changed how I view online interactions and dating. I'm much more guarded now about what I share online. I've sworn off dating apps entirely. The risk just isn't worth it to me anymore. Sometimes I wonder if I overreacted or if it was all just an elaborate prank. But then I remember the genuine fear I felt, the sleepless nights, the way my whole life was upended. No one should have to go through that just for politely rejecting someone after one mediocre date. I'm sharing this as a cautionary tale. Be careful what information you put out there. Trust your instincts if someone gives you a bad vibe. And don't be afraid to involve authorities if you feel unsafe, even if they can't do much right away. Document everything. I'm slowly rebuilding my life and trying to move past this, but the experience will stay with me forever. To anyone else who has dealt with this kind of harassment, you're not alone, and it's not your fault. Stay safe out there, everyone. I was 21 when it happened. Just a normal Tuesday in January, heading home after my evening class at the community college downtown. The bitter winter wind whipped around me as I descended the steps into the subway station, my breath forming little clouds in the frigid air. I was exhausted and looking forward to getting home, warming up and crawling into bed. The platform was eerily quiet when I arrived. Usually at this time, around 9:30 p.m., there were at least a few other commuters waiting for the train. But tonight, I was alone. I pulled my coat tighter around me and shifted from foot to foot, trying to stay warm as I waited. Finally, the train arrived with a screech of metal on metal. I boarded quickly, relieved to be out of the cold. As we rattled through the dark tunnels, I noticed the car was nearly empty. Just me and an older woman dozing in the corner. I tried to shake off an uneasy feeling. It wasn't that unusual for the subway to be quiet on a weeknight in winter, I told myself. 20 minutes later, we pulled into my stop. I got off, my footsteps echoing in the deserted station. As I climbed the stairs to street level, a gust of icy wind hit me full in the face. I shivered and looked around. The streets were completely empty. No cars, no pedestrians, nothing. Just dark storefronts and swirling snow under the dim streetlights. A flicker of panic rose in my chest. Where was everyone? This area was usually bustling, even late at night. There were popular bars and restaurants just a block away. But now, it was like a ghost town. I pulled out my phone, thinking I should call an Uber. To my dismay, I saw I had no cell service. Of course, this neighborhood was notorious for bad reception. Swallowing hard, I decided to start walking. My apartment was only about 10 minutes away. I'd be fine. I'd gone about a block when I heard it, the soft whir of bicycle wheels on pavement behind me. I glanced back and saw a man on a bike, slowly pedaling in my direction. He was bundled up against the cold, a dark hat pulled low over his face. My heart started to race. I picked up my pace, my boots crunching in the light dusting of snow. The cyclist sped up too, getting closer. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called out. His voice was rough, slurring slightly. "What's a pretty thing like you doing out here all alone?" I didn't respond, just walked faster. He was right beside me now, slowly circling on his bike. "Aw, come on, don't be like that," he said. "I'm just trying to be friendly. Why don't you let me give you a ride home?" He reached out as if to grab my arm. I jerked away, nearly slipping on a patch of ice. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm fine. I don't need a ride." He laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. "Don't be scared, baby. I just want to talk." I broke into a run, my bag bouncing against my hip. But the icy sidewalk was treacherous. I made it only a few steps before my feet went out from under me, and I crashed to the ground, pain shooting through my palms and knees. Before I could get up, he was there. He dropped his bike and crouched beside me, grabbing my shoulders. "Shh, it's okay," he said, his alcohol-laced breath hot on my face. "I've got you." I struggled, trying to push him away, but he was much stronger. He wrapped his arms around me in a bear hug, pinning my arms to my sides. I could feel the rough stubble of his cheek as he pressed his face against mine. "Just one little kiss," he mumbled. "Come on, don't fight it." Tears were streaming down my face now. I thrashed wildly, trying to kick him, to scream, anything. But it felt like my throat had closed up in terror. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not to me. And then suddenly, miraculously, I heard another voice. "Hey, what's going on here?" The man loosened his grip, startled. I wrenched free and scrambled backward, looking up to see another cyclist approaching fast. As he got closer, I saw with overwhelming relief that he was wearing a police uniform. My attacker swore and leapt to his feet, grabbing his bike. But the officer was faster, cutting him off before he could flee. "Don't move," the cop ordered, his hand on his weapon. To me, he said gently, "Are you all right, miss? Did he hurt you?" I shook my head, still too shaken to speak. The officer called for backup on his radio, keeping his eyes on the other man the whole time. It was all a blur after that. More police arrived. They took my statement, called an ambulance to check me over, even though I insisted I was physically fine. One kind female officer draped a blanket around my shoulders and sat with me while I gave my account of what happened. Hours later, I was finally cleared to go home. A police cruiser dropped me off at my building. I thanked the officers profusely, my hands still shaking as I unlocked my door. Once inside, I collapsed onto my couch, utterly drained. The events of the night kept replaying in my head. If that cop hadn't shown up when he did... I shuddered, unable to finish the thought. I called my mom, needing to hear her voice. As soon as she answered, I broke down sobbing, the full impact of what I'd been through finally hitting me. She listened as I poured out the whole story, making soothing noises. "Oh, honey," she said when I'd finished. "I'm so sorry that happened to you. But you're safe now. You did everything right." We talked for over an hour. By the time we hung up, I felt calmer, though still shaky. I made myself some tea and curled up in bed, leaving all the lights on. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt his hands on me. I kept imagining what might have happened if things had gone differently. The next few weeks were rough. I jumped at every sound, flinched when anyone got too close on the street. I couldn't bring myself to take the subway. I spent a fortune on Ubers that month. My friends and family were wonderfully supportive, but I still felt on edge all the time. Gradually, things got better. I started seeing a therapist, which helped immensely. I took a self-defense class. Slowly, I regained my confidence and started venturing out alone again. But even now, years later, I'm still affected by what happened that night. I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings, always looking over my shoulder. I never wear headphones when I'm walking alone. And I avoid that subway stop entirely. I'll walk an extra 10 minutes to the next one over. Sometimes I wonder about that cop who saved me. Did he know how close he came to preventing a tragedy? Does he ever think about that snowy night? Or was it just another shift for him? I never got his name, but I'll be forever grateful to him. I share this story as a reminder to always trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And to my fellow city dwellers, please, always be aware of your surroundings. It only takes a moment for things to go terribly wrong. I was lucky. So many others aren't. I'll carry that night with me forever, a chilling reminder of how quickly safety can turn to danger, even in familiar places. But I refuse to let fear rule my life. I'm a survivor, and I'm stronger for what I've been through. I was only 13 that summer, but the memory of what happened at Lake Willow still sends chills down my spine. My best friend Kay and I had been looking forward to our annual camping trip for months. Our families always rented cabins at the same lakeside campground, and we'd spend lazy days swimming, hiking, and roasting marshmallows under the stars. This particular day started out like any other. Kay and I woke up early, scarfed down some cereal, and raced each other down to the lake. The morning air was crisp and cool against our skin as we made our way to the wooden dock. We loved sitting at the end with our feet dangling in the water, watching the mist rise off the glassy surface. As we approached, I noticed a man standing near the dock that I didn't recognize. He looked to be in his 40s, with graying hair and a friendly smile. I figured he must be another camper staying at the grounds. "Good morning, girls," he called out cheerfully as we got closer. "Beautiful day for a swim, isn't it?" Kay and I exchanged glances. We'd been taught not to talk to strangers, but he seemed nice enough. Plus, we were still within sight of the cabins. What harm could come from a little small talk? "Yeah, it's perfect," I replied with a shy smile. We made our way to the end of the dock and sat down, letting our toes skim the cool water. The man walked over and leaned against one of the posts nearby. "I'm Jim," he said. "Are you two staying at the campground?" We nodded, and I introduced myself and Kay. Jim asked us how long we'd been coming to Lake Willow, and we eagerly told him about our annual trips. He was easy to talk to, laughing at our stories and asking lots of questions. Before I knew it, nearly an hour had passed. "Say," Jim said suddenly, "would you girls like to see something really special? There's a secret island just across the lake that hardly anyone knows about. It's got the most amazing view of the mountains." Kay's eyes lit up. An island. That sounds so cool. I hesitated. "I don't know. We should probably ask our parents first." Jim waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, it'll just take a few minutes to zip over there and back. They won't even know you're gone. Come on, live a little. How often do you get a chance for a real adventure?" I glanced at Kay, who was practically bouncing with excitement. "Please," she begged, "it'll be so much fun." Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. Jim's enthusiasm was contagious, and the idea of exploring a secret island was tempting. Plus, we could see the island from here. It really wasn't far. "Great," Jim exclaimed. "My boat's just over there. Let's go." As we followed him down the dock, a nagging feeling of unease crept over me. Something about this didn't feel right. But Kay was already climbing into the small motorboat, and I didn't want to seem like a baby in front of her. Jim helped me aboard, his hand lingering a bit too long on my arm. I tried to brush off the discomfort, telling myself I was being paranoid. But when he bent down to untie the boat, I caught a whiff of alcohol on his breath. My heart started to race. "Wait," I said quickly. "Maybe we should tell someone where we're going first." Jim's cheerful demeanor slipped for just a second, revealing a flash of anger in his eyes. But then the smile was back, wider than ever. "Don't be silly," he said. "We'll be back before anyone even notices. Now sit down so we can get going." I opened my mouth to protest again, but suddenly a booming voice called out from the shore. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" I whipped around to see my Uncle Jack striding purposefully down the dock, his face a mask of fury. Relief flooded through me. "Uncle Jack," I cried out, "we were just—" "Get out of that boat right now," he ordered, cutting me off. "Both of you." Confused and a little frightened by his tone, Kay and I scrambled back onto the dock. Uncle Jack put a protective arm around each of us, glaring daggers at Jim. "And you," he growled, "I suggest you get the hell out of here before I call the police." Jim's friendly mask had vanished completely. He sneered at us as he started the boat's engine. "Whatever," he spat. "Plenty more fish in the sea." As he sped away, I realized with horror that the boat didn't even belong to him. I could see the real owner running down the beach, shouting about his stolen property. Uncle Jack hugged us tightly. "Are you girls okay? Did he hurt you?" We shook our heads, still in shock. "I can't believe how stupid we were," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "He seemed so nice." "It's not your fault," Uncle Jack assured us. "Predators like that are experts at seeming trustworthy. But you can't ever go off with a stranger, no matter how friendly they seem. Do you understand?" We nodded solemnly, the full gravity of what almost happened sinking in. If Uncle Jack hadn't shown up when he did, I shuddered, unable to complete the thought. The rest of the day passed in a blur of police statements and tearful conversations with our parents. I expected them to be furious, but they were just relieved we were safe. That night, as Kay and I huddled in our sleeping bags, neither of us could sleep. Every sound from the woods made us jump. I kept replaying the day's events in my mind, thinking of all the little red flags I'd ignored, the alcohol on his breath, the way his hand lingered too long, the flash of anger when I hesitated. "I can't believe we almost got in that boat," Kay whispered. "What do you think he would have done to us?" I shook my head, not wanting to imagine. "I don't know, but I don't think we ever would have come back." We were silent for a long moment, the weight of our close call hanging heavy in the air. "Promise me something," I said finally. "Promise we'll never do anything that stupid again. No matter how nice someone seems or how fun it sounds, we stick together and we tell an adult first, okay?" "I promise," Kay said solemnly. We pinky swore on it, cementing our pact. It would be years before either of us felt truly comfortable around strangers again. To this day, I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings and trust my gut when something feels off. I often wonder what became of Jim, if he was ever caught, or if he went on to hurt other children who weren't as lucky as Kay and I. The thought makes me sick to my stomach. All I can do is be grateful for Uncle Jack's perfect timing, and hope that by sharing my story, I can prevent others from making the same potentially deadly mistake. Lake Willow was our favorite place in the world, but we never went back after that summer. Some experiences change you forever, leaving scars that never fully heal. But they also make you stronger, wiser, and more aware of the dangers that can lurk behind a friendly smile. I'll never forget that day on the dock, or how close we came to becoming just another tragic headline. It's a lesson I'll carry with me always, a constant reminder to stay vigilant and trust my instincts. As I got closer, they spread out a bit, partially blocking the sidewalk. My heart started racing, but I tried to keep my cool. Just as I was about to pass them, one of the men stepped directly in front of me. "Halt," he said firmly. "Police, we need to see some identification." Alarm bells went off in my head immediately. These guys didn't look like cops at all. No uniforms, no badges visible. This had to be some kind of setup. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm on the outside while my mind raced. I knew I had to think fast. "Oh, thank God you're here, officers," I said, putting on my best relieved expression. "I was just about to call for help. There's a group of Russian gangsters following me. I think they're trying to mug me or worse." The cops looked at each other, seeming thrown off by my response. I pressed on quickly before they could regroup. "They're right around the corner," I said urgently. "If we hurry, we can catch them. I can identify them for you." I gestured back the way I'd come, as if eager to lead them to the imaginary Russians. The ringleader hesitated, clearly not sure how to respond to this unexpected turn. We'll check it out," he said finally. You should get home safely now. Are you sure? I asked, trying to sound concerned. I'd feel much safer if I could stay with you officers until those Russians are caught. That won't be necessary, the man said gruffly. We've got it under control. Move along now. I nodded gratefully. Thank you so much, officers. I feel much better knowing you're on the case. As I walked away, I could hear them muttering to each other behind me. I resisted the urge to break into a run, forcing myself to keep a steady pace until I was around the corner and out of sight. Once I was sure I was clear, I let out a huge sigh of relief and slumped against a wall, my legs shaking. I couldn't believe that had actually worked. The adrenaline was still coursing through me. Looking back, I realized how incredibly lucky I was that they bought my bluff. If they had called me on it, things could have gone very badly. But in that moment of panic, playing on fears of Russian criminals in the area was the first thing that popped into my head. I hurried the rest of the way home, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally made it to my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed onto my couch, still trembling slightly. It took me a long time to fall asleep that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, thinking of all the ways it could have gone wrong. What if they had gotten violent? What if there had been real cops nearby and I'd inadvertently sent a group of criminals their way? The next day, I seriously considered reporting the incident to the actual police, but I was worried about potential retaliation if the men found out. And to be honest, a part of me was embarrassed about how easily I'd fallen for their initial ruse. So in the end, I kept it to myself. For weeks afterwards, I was jumpy and paranoid whenever I went out at night. I started varying my routes home and avoiding that particular street entirely. I also began carrying pepper spray, just in case. Gradually the fear faded and life went back to normal. But that night left a lasting impact on me. It made me much more aware of my surroundings and taught me the value of quick thinking in dangerous situations. Looking back now, I'm still amazed at how I managed to keep my cool and come up with that story on the spot. I'm not usually that quick on my feet. I guess the surge of adrenaline and survival instinct took over. I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd reacted differently, if I'd tried to run, or if I'd gone along with their fake police act. Would they have robbed me? Beaten me up? I'll never know for sure. The incident also made me reflect on how easily criminals can impersonate authority figures to take advantage of people. It's a scary thought, but an important one to be aware of. I still live in Berlin, and I still love this city. But that night changed the way I move through it, especially after dark. I'm more cautious now, more observant, and I always trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. Sometimes I catch myself scanning crowds, wondering if I'll see those men again. So far I haven't. But the memory of that night is always there in the back of my mind, a reminder of how quickly a normal evening can turn into something terrifying. I've shared this story with a few close friends, partly as a warning to be careful, and partly to process the experience myself. Their reactions have ranged from horror to admiration for my quick thinking. But unless you've been in a situation like that, it's hard to truly understand how it feels. The whole incident probably only lasted a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Time seemed to slow down, and every word, every movement felt crucial. It's amazing how the mind can focus so intently when you're in genuine fear for your safety. I've often wondered about those men. Were they experienced criminals or just opportunists? Did they target me specifically, or was I just in the wrong place at the wrong time? And most importantly, did they ever try this scheme again on someone else who might not have been as lucky? There's a part of me that feels guilty for potentially putting other people at risk by not reporting it. But at the time, all I could think about was my own safety and getting away from the situation as quickly as possible. This experience has definitely made me more sympathetic to victims of crime. It's easy to say what you would do in a dangerous situation, but when you're actually in the moment, it's a whole different story. Fear can paralyze you, or it can push you to do things you never thought you were capable of. I'm grateful that my instincts kicked in and I was able to talk my way out of the situation. But I'm also acutely aware of how differently things could have gone. It's a sobering thought. Now, whenever I hear stories of people being mugged or assaulted, I don't judge their reactions. I know firsthand how unpredictable and terrifying those situations can be. You never really know how you'll react until you're in the moment. I still enjoy living in Berlin, but I'm much more cautious now, especially at night. I make sure my phone is always charged when I go out, I stay aware of my surroundings, and I'm not afraid to trust my gut if something feels off. This experience taught me that danger can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. By taking control of the narrative, I was able to turn the tables on my potential attackers and escape unharmed. But it also taught me the value of community and looking out for one another. Now, if I see someone who looks uncomfortable or in potential danger, I don't hesitate to check if they're okay or offer help. We all need to look out for each other. In the end, I'm just grateful that I made it home safely that night. But the memory of those tense moments on that dark Berlin street will stay with me forever. A stark reminder of how quickly life can change and how important it is to stay alert and think on your feet. I was shaking as I sat on my worn couch, clutching a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The storm outside raged on, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the trees surrounding my isolated farmhouse. But it wasn't the storm that had me on edge. It was the events of earlier that evening that left me utterly terrified and unable to sleep. It had started out as a typical dreary night on the farm. I was curled up reading a book, trying to ignore the deafening cracks of thunder that made me jump every few minutes. The old farmhouse creaked and groaned, settling into itself as it had done for generations. My family had owned this property for over a century, though I was the first to live here alone. At 28, I had inherited it after my parents passed away last year. While I loved the peace and quiet most days, nights like this made me acutely aware of just how isolated I was out here. Around 9 p.m., there was a loud, urgent knocking at the front door. I froze, my heart racing. Who on earth would be out here on a night like this? Cautiously, I approached the door and called out, "Who's there?" A man's voice responded, sounding distressed. "Please, I'm so sorry to bother you, but my car broke down on the road and my phone is dead. Could I possibly use your phone to call for help?" I hesitated, torn between wanting to help and being wary of strangers. Eventually, my Midwestern hospitality won out. "Hold on, I'm coming," I called back, unlocking the door. As I opened it, I was hit with a gust of wind and rain. Standing on my porch was a man who looked to be in his mid-30s, soaking wet and shivering. He gave me a relieved smile. "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm David." "Emma," I replied, stepping back to let him in. "The phone's in the kitchen. Come on in." David followed me inside, his shoes squeaking on the hardwood floors. As we entered the kitchen, he glanced around, taking in the worn cabinets and antique appliances. "Wow, this place is incredible. So much history here." I nodded, handing him the cordless phone. "Yeah, it's been in my family for generations." As David dialed, I noticed him examining the room more closely, his eyes lingering on certain spots. When he finished his call, he turned to me with an odd expression. "You know, it's funny. This kitchen reminds me so much of my grandmother's old place. She even had that exact same chip in the countertop, right there by the sink." I frowned, glancing at the chip he'd pointed out. It had happened when I was a kid, dropping a heavy pot while helping my mom cook. How could he possibly know about that? "Oh, what a coincidence," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you get through to someone?" David nodded, but made no move to leave. Instead, he wandered into the living room, looking around with increasing interest. "You said this place has been in your family for generations? That's fascinating. I bet it has so many stories to tell." Alarm bells were starting to go off in my head. Something about his demeanor felt off, almost too familiar with the space. "Yeah, lots of history," I said vaguely. "So when is your ride coming?" David turned to me, a strange glint in his eye. "Oh, it'll be a while yet. This storm is making travel difficult. Say, is that old rocking chair still up in the attic? The one with the intricate carvings on the arms?" I felt the blood drain from my face. There was no way he could know about that chair. It had been my great-grandmother's, and it had been stored in our attic for decades. I'd only seen it once as a child. I'm not sure what you're talking about," I stammered, backing away slightly. Look, I think it's best if you wait outside for your ride. I'm not comfortable having a stranger in my home. David's expression darkened. Oh, come on, Emma. Don't be like that. We're practically old friends, aren't we? After all, I know this house almost as well as you do. My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely hear over the rush of blood in my ears. Who are you? How do you know these things? He took a step towards me, smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. I told you, I'm David, and I know lots of things about this place, like how the third step from the top on the back stairs creaks so loud it'll wake the dead, or how there's a hidden compartment behind the fireplace where your great-grandfather used to stash his moonshine during Prohibition. I was shaking now, tears pricking at my eyes. Please leave, now, or I'm calling the police. David's smile faded, replaced by a look of anger. Now that's not very hospitable, is it? After all, I'm just a stranded traveler seeking shelter from the storm. It would be a shame if something were to happen to me out there in this weather. People might start asking questions. The threat in his words was unmistakable. I backed away further, fumbling behind me for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around the handle of a large kitchen knife on the counter. I won't ask again, I said, my voice quavering as I brought the knife into view. Get out of my house, now. For a long moment, David just stared at me, his eyes cold and calculating. Then, slowly, he raised his hands and began backing towards the door. All right. No need to get violent. I can see when I'm not wanted. I followed him, knife still raised, as he made his way to the front door. As he stepped out onto the porch, he turned back to me with a chilling smile. This isn't over, Emma. I'll be seeing you again soon. After all, we have so much catching up to do. With that, he disappeared into the stormy night. I slammed the door shut, locking it and sliding the deadbolt into place with trembling hands. Then I sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably as the full weight of what had just happened hit me. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, jumping at every sound, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. As dawn broke, I called the police to report what had happened. They took my statement and promised to keep an eye out, but with no real evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself constantly on edge. I installed a security system, got a large dog for protection, and even considered selling the farm and moving away. But this place was my home, my heritage. I refused to let some creep drive me away from it. Even now, months later, I still have trouble sleeping at night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sets my heart racing. I keep replaying that night over and over, wondering how David knew so much about my home and family. Was he some distant relative I'd never met? A stalker who had been watching me? Or something even more sinister? I may never know the truth, but one thing's for certain. I'll never again open my door to a stranger on a dark and stormy night. The safety I once felt in my isolated farmhouse has been shattered, replaced by a constant, gnawing fear that someday, somehow, David will make good on his promise to return. And next time, a kitchen knife might not be enough to save me. I was driving down a lonely stretch of highway, the rain pounding against my windshield with such force I could barely see the road ahead. The weather forecast had warned of severe thunderstorms, but I hadn't expected anything like this. Lightning illuminated the sky every few seconds, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that made me flinch each time. I was on my way to visit my sister in the next state over, a trip I'd made dozens of times before. But I'd never encountered a storm this intense. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, leaning forward and squinting through the downpour. Suddenly, there was a loud pop and my car lurched to the side. No, I muttered, fighting to keep control as I pulled onto the narrow shoulder. The car shuddered to a stop, and I sat there for a moment, heart racing. I'd blown a tire. I fumbled for my phone, but of course there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. Cursing under my breath, I popped the trunk and grabbed my raincoat before stepping out into the deluge. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet as I made my way to inspect the damage. Sure enough, my front driver's side tire was completely shredded. I had a spare, but changing it in this weather would be next to impossible, not to mention dangerous on the side of the highway. I was weighing my options when headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the sheets of rain. Relief washed over me as I saw it was a tow truck. What incredible luck! The truck pulled up behind me, and a burly man in a yellow slicker hopped out. "Having some car trouble?" he called over the howling wind. "Blew a tire," I shouted back. "Any chance you can give me a tow to the nearest town?" He nodded. "Sure thing. Hop in and we'll get you out of this mess." I grabbed my phone and wallet from the car, then climbed into the passenger seat of the tow truck. The cab was blessedly warm and dry. "Thanks so much," I said, removing my drenched coat. "I can't believe my luck that you happened to be driving by." The driver grunted non-committally as he pulled back onto the highway. Now that I could see him clearly, I noticed he was older than I'd first thought, probably in his 60s, with a grizzled beard and deep-set eyes. "Where you headed?" he asked gruffly. "Next town over is fine," I replied. "Anywhere I can get my tire fixed." He nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. We drove in silence for several minutes, the only sound the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers. I was starting to relax when I realized we seemed to be turning off the main highway. Where exactly are we going?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. "Shortcut," the driver replied. "Get you there quicker." But as we continued down an unmarked dirt road, my unease grew. The trees pressed in close on either side, branches scraping against the truck. We hadn't passed any signs of civilization in what felt like ages. "Look, I really appreciate the help, but maybe you could just take me back to the highway," I suggested. "I can wait for another tow there." The driver's grip tightened on the wheel. "Don't worry," he said, his tone oddly flat. "We're almost there." My heart began to race. This was wrong, all wrong. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. "Let me out," I demanded, unable to keep the panic from my voice. "Stop the truck right now." A cruel smile spread across the driver's weathered face. "Now why would I do that when we're having so much fun?" Terror seized me as I realized the grave danger I was in. My mind raced, trying to figure a way out of this nightmare. But before I could act, the truck jerked to a stop in front of a dilapidated old barn. The driver turned to me, his eyes gleaming with malice. "End of the line, friend." I lunged for the door, frantically pulling at the handle. To my shock, it opened. He must have unlocked it when we stopped. I tumbled out onto the muddy ground as the driver cursed. Scrambling to my feet, I took off running into the storm. I could hear him crashing through the undergrowth behind me, shouting threats. Lightning flashed, momentarily blinding me. I stumbled but kept going, branches whipping at my face. My lungs burned as I ran faster than I ever had in my life. The sound of pursuit faded, but I didn't dare slow down. I had no idea where I was or which direction led back to the highway. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the tree line onto a paved road. Gasping for breath, I looked wildly in both directions, praying to see headlights. As if in answer to my desperate wish, a vehicle appeared in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, terrified it would pass me by. To my immense relief, it slowed to a stop. It was another tow truck. A young man leaned out the window. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." Between ragged breaths, I managed to gasp out my story. The blown tire, the creepy driver, my narrow escape. The man's eyes widened in alarm. "Holy shit, get in," he said, reaching across to unlock the passenger door. "We need to call the cops right away." As we sped toward town, I provided as many details as I could remember to the 911 dispatcher. By the time we reached the local police station, several patrol cars were already heading out to search the area. I spent the next few hours giving my official statement and answering endless questions. They seemed skeptical at first, but became more concerned as they were unable to locate any trace of the mysterious tow truck driver. When they finally allowed me to leave, I was utterly exhausted. The young tow truck driver who'd rescued me insisted on giving me a ride to the nearest motel. "You've been through hell tonight," he said. "The least I can do is make sure you get some rest." I was beyond grateful for his kindness. As I settled into the lumpy motel bed, my mind kept replaying the night's terrifying events. Sleep seemed impossible, but eventually sheer emotional and physical exhaustion won out. I awoke to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. For a blissful moment, I thought perhaps it had all been a nightmare, but the aches in my body and the scratches on my arms confirmed the horrifying reality. After a long, hot shower, I made my way to the tiny motel office. The elderly woman at the desk looked up as I entered. "You're all over the news, young man," she said, gesturing to a small TV in the corner. Sure enough, there was my car on the screen, still sitting on the side of the highway. The reporter was saying that despite an extensive search, no trace had been found of the tow truck or its driver. I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly weak. What if they never found him? What if he was still out there, prowling the roads for his next victim? The police called later that morning to say they'd located the abandoned barn, but there was no sign anyone had been there recently. The case remained frustratingly open. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself jumping at every sound, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I couldn't bring myself to drive alone at night. The tiniest car problem filled me with irrational panic. Months have passed, and the police have all but given up. They chalk it up to some twisted prank or a figment of my imagination. But I know what I experienced that night was terrifyingly real. I still lie awake some nights, remembering the malevolent gleam in that driver's eyes, wondering if he's still out there, waiting for another stranded motorist to fall into his trap. The rational part of my brain says I'm safe now, that lightning doesn't strike twice. But a primal fear lingers, whispering that perhaps someday, somehow, I'll find myself once again at the mercy of that nightmarish tow truck driver. So I'm sharing my story as a warning. If you find yourself broken down on a lonely road some stormy night, think twice before accepting help from a stranger. You never know what sinister intentions may lurk behind a seemingly helpful facade. Stay safe out there and trust your instincts. I only wish I'd listened to mine before climbing into that truck. The memory of that night will haunt me for the rest of my days. I still remember that weekend like it was yesterday. The four of us, Jenny, Alex, Rachel, and myself, had been planning our mountain getaway for months. We were all so excited to escape the city and spend a few days relaxing at this quaint little cabin we'd rented. As we drove up the winding mountain roads, the weather started to turn. Dark clouds rolled in, and a light drizzle began to fall. By the time we reached the cabin, it was pouring rain. We rushed inside with our bags, laughing as we shook the water from our hair and clothes. The cabin was cozy and rustic, with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking the misty forest. We got a fire going and settled in for the evening, cracking open some beers and playing card games as the storm raged outside. Around 9 p.m., there was a loud knock at the door. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. Who could possibly be out in this weather? Alex cautiously went to answer it, while the rest of us waited anxiously. Standing on the porch was a man in his 40s, soaking wet and looking somewhat disheveled. He introduced himself as Tom and explained that his car had broken down about a mile down the road. He asked if he could use our phone to call for help. My first instinct was sympathy. The poor guy was stranded in this awful storm, but something about his demeanor felt off. His eyes darted around nervously and he seemed overly eager to get inside. Against my better judgment, we invited him in to dry off and use the landline. As Tom made his call, I noticed him studying the cabin intently, his gaze lingering on each of us. A chill ran down my spine. When Tom hung up, he said the earliest a tow truck could come was morning. He asked if he could stay the night, offering to sleep on the couch. We all exchanged uneasy glances. None of us wanted a stranger staying over, but it felt cruel to turn him away in this weather. Reluctantly, we agreed he could stay. Tom thanked us profusely, but there was an odd glint in his eye that made my skin crawl. As the night wore on, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He asked probing questions about our lives and relationships. At one point, I caught him rifling through our bags when he thought no one was looking. My unease grew into full-blown panic when I went to use the bathroom and noticed Tom's jacket hanging by the door. A folded paper was sticking out of the pocket. My hands shaking, I carefully pulled it out. It was a crude map of the area, with our cabin circled in red. Scrawled in the margins were notes, 4 targets, and 2M, 2F. My blood ran cold as I realized the horrifying truth. This man had targeted us. He hadn't ended up here by accident at all. I quietly showed the others what I'd found. We were all terrified, trapped in this remote cabin with a potential killer. But we knew we had to act fast. We devised a plan. Rachel pretended to get a call from her boyfriend, a local sheriff who was on his way over. As she loudly discussed his imminent arrival, Tom's face went pale. He stammered some excuse about feeling better and needing to check on his car. As he headed for the door, Alex and I flanked him. We made it clear in no uncertain terms that we knew what he was up to and that he needed to leave immediately. Tom's friendly facade crumbled, replaced by a look of cold rage that still haunts my nightmares. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might attack us, but outnumbered 4-1, he seemed to think better of it. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out into the rain. We immediately locked and barricaded the door, then called the real police. They arrived about an hour later to take our statements. They found Tom's abandoned car down the road, loaded with duct tape, rope, and other sinister items. To this day, I shudder to think what might have happened if we hadn't discovered his true intentions. The police never managed to track Tom down. He seemingly vanished into thin air that night. I still have trouble sleeping sometimes, imagining what horrors we narrowly escaped. That weekend taught me to always trust my instincts. Evil can lurk behind the friendliest faces, waiting for an opportunity to strike. We were lucky to make it out unharmed, but the psychological scars remain. Whenever I see stories of missing hikers or campers in the news, I can't help but wonder, did they encounter someone like Tom? Someone who seemed harmless at first, but harbored dark intentions? It's a chilling thought that still keeps me up at night all these years later. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Please always be aware of your surroundings and trust your gut feelings. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. Don't be afraid to be rude if it means protecting yourself and your loved ones. Our quiet getaway turned into a nightmare, but it could have been so much worse. I'm grateful every day that we made it out alive, but I'll never forget the look in Tom's eyes as he left, the cold, dead stare of a predator whose plan had been foiled. I only hope he never succeeded in hurting anyone else. Stay safe out there, everyone. You never know who might be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Our world can be a dangerous place, but by staying vigilant and looking out for each other, we can make it through even the darkest nights. I've never been so terrified in my life. It all started when I decided to spend a few days at my family's beach house during a nasty storm that was rolling through. I thought it would be peaceful, just me, the sound of the crashing waves, and a good book. Boy, was I wrong. The first day was actually pretty nice. I arrived in the afternoon, got settled in, and spent the evening watching the storm build from the safety of the living room. The wind was really picking up, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I remember thinking how glad I was to be inside, warm and dry. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard the first knock at the door. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Who the hell could that be out in this weather? I cautiously approached the door and peered out the peephole. 2 men were standing there, soaked to the bone and looking pretty ragged. Against my better judgment, I cracked the door open. They introduced themselves as Mike and Jeff and said their boat had gotten caught in the storm. They'd seen the lights on in our house and were hoping to use a phone to call for help. I hesitated for a moment, but they seemed harmless enough. Plus, I'd feel awful turning someone away in this weather. So I let them in. At first, everything seemed fine. I got them some towels to dry off and showed them to the landline in the kitchen. Mike made a call while Jeff paced around, looking out the windows at the raging storm. I tried to make small talk, asking where they were from and if they vacationed here often. Their answers were vague, and they kept glancing at each other. That's when I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something just felt off. I noticed Jeff eyeing up the valuables in the living room a little too intently, and Mike's call seemed to be taking an awfully long time. I casually mentioned that my parents would be arriving soon, hoping that might deter any funny business. Mike hung up the phone and gave me a strange look. "I thought you said you were here alone," he asked. A chill ran down my spine. I had never mentioned that. From that moment on, their whole demeanor changed. The polite smiles were gone, replaced by cold, calculating stares. They started asking pointed questions about the house, how many bedrooms, if there was a safe, that kind of thing. Jeff wandered into the living room and picked up a framed family photo. "Nice place you've got here," he said with a smirk. "Bet your folks are loaded." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear over the blood rushing in my ears. I knew I was in serious trouble. These guys weren't stranded boaters. They were criminals who had targeted our house, and I had let them right in. I tried to keep my voice steady as I suggested they should probably get going. Mike's eyes narrowed. "What's the rush?" he asked, taking a step towards me. "I think we'll stick around for a while. You've been such a gracious host after all." Jeff chuckled darkly. "Yeah, why don't you give us a tour of the place? I'm especially interested in seeing the master bedroom. Bet that's where all the good stuff is kept." I was desperately trying to figure out an escape plan. The storm was still raging outside, but at this point, I'd rather take my chances out there than stay trapped in here with these two. I inched towards the back door, hoping I could make a break for it. But Mike must have sensed what I was thinking. In 2 quick strides, he was between me and the door. "Going somewhere?" he growled. That's when the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, lit only by occasional flashes of lightning. I heard Jeff swear and Mike shout something. In that moment of confusion, I acted on pure instinct. I shoved past Mike with all my strength and bolted for the door. I fumbled with the lock for what felt like an eternity before finally wrenching it open. The wind and rain hit me like a physical force as I stumbled out onto the deck. I could hear Mike and Jeff shouting behind me, their heavy footsteps in pursuit. I ran blindly through the storm, my bare feet slipping in the wet sand. The beach house next door was dark, no one there to help. I veered towards the road, praying I could flag down a passing car. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me backwards. It was Mike. His face was twisted with rage as he shouted something I couldn't hear over the howling wind. I reacted without thinking, my fist connecting solidly with his jaw. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. I used that split second to my advantage and took off running again. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I made it to the main road and started waving my arms frantically at the headlights of an approaching car. To my immense relief, it was a police cruiser. The officer inside looked shocked to see a soaking wet, terrified woman appear out of nowhere. I was babbling incoherently, trying to explain what had happened between gasping breaths. The next few hours were a blur. More police arrived, guns drawn as they approached the beach house. Mike and Jeff were caught trying to flee out the back. It turns out they were wanted in 3 states for a string of home invasions. They'd been staking out vacation homes in the area, waiting for the perfect opportunity. I gave my statement to the police, still shaking like a leaf. They praised me for my quick thinking and bravery, but I didn't feel brave. I felt stupid for ever letting those men in, and utterly terrified by how close I'd come to God knows what. It's been a few months now, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. I have trouble sleeping and I startle at every little noise. I can't even look at the beach house without feeling sick to my stomach. My parents want to sell it, but part of me doesn't want to let those bastards take that away from us too. I know I'm lucky. Things could have ended so much worse. But I can't shake the memory of those cold, predatory eyes, or the sound of footsteps chasing me through the storm. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. So let my experience be a warning. Trust your gut instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And please, be careful who you let into your home. You never know who might be wearing a friendly mask, hiding much darker intentions beneath. "What have we got?" I asked, hurrying over to help. "Male, mid-30s, no ID, found unconscious on the side of the road," one of the EMTs responded tersely. "Vitals are stable, but he's completely unresponsive. Possible head trauma." I helped wheel the man to an empty bed in the ER. His clothes were soaked through, mud caked on his shoes. There was something off about him that I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted around beneath closed lids, or how his fingers kept twitching. "I'll take it from here," I told the paramedics. "Thanks, guys." As they left, I started the usual intake process, hooking up monitors, checking vitals, searching for any obvious injuries. The whole time I had this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. But every time I glanced at the patient, his eyes were still closed. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on my job. "Sir, can you hear me?" I asked loudly, shining a penlight in his eyes. No response. Just then, the power flickered ominously. A few seconds later, it went out completely, plunging the ER into darkness. Shit, I muttered. The backup generator should have kicked in immediately. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the bed beside me. My blood ran cold. I slowly turned, pointing my phone's light toward the patient. His eyes were open now, reflecting the light like an animal's, and they were fixed directly on me with a predatory intensity that made my skin crawl. Before I could react, he lunged at me with inhuman speed. I barely managed to stumble backwards, narrowly avoiding his grasping hands. He let out an animalistic shriek that chilled me to my core. "Help!" I yelled, hoping someone would hear me over the storm. "Security!" But in that moment of distraction, he was on me. We crashed to the floor, my phone skittering away and leaving us in near total darkness. His weight pinned me down as he clawed and snapped at my face. I could feel his hot, rancid breath on my skin. Panic surged through me. This wasn't a normal patient, this was something else entirely, something monstrous. And it was trying to kill me. I fought with everything I had, desperately trying to push him off. But he was inhumanly strong. His fingers found my throat and started to squeeze. Spots danced in my vision as I gasped for air. In a last-ditch effort, I managed to grab a nearby metal tray and smash it against the side of his head. The impact stunned him just long enough for me to wiggle free and scramble to my feet. I ran blindly through the darkened ER, hearing him snarl and give chase behind me. My only thought was to get away, to find help, to survive. I burst through a set of double doors, finding myself in a long hallway. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow, creating monstrous shadows. My pursuer's footsteps echoed behind me, getting closer. I sprinted down the hall, my heart pounding in my ears. Where was everyone? Why wasn't anyone responding to the commotion? I tried door after door, finding them all locked. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was trapped. Just as I was about to give up hope, I spotted a sliver of natural light at the end of the hall, an exit sign above a door. Freedom. With a final burst of energy, I raced toward it. I could hear ragged breathing right behind me, feel clawed fingers grasping at my back. I slammed into the door at full speed, praying it wasn't locked. By some miracle, it gave way. I tumbled out into the raging storm, rain immediately soaking me to the bone. But I didn't stop. I kept running, my feet splashing through puddles, until I reached the parking lot. Only then did I dare to look back. The door hung open, but there was no sign of my pursuer. Had he given up? Or was he waiting, watching from the shadows? I didn't stick around to find out. I jumped into my car, peeled out of the lot, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of what just happened started to sink in. What the hell was that thing? Why didn't anyone come to help? And most disturbingly, what happened to the other patients and staff in the hospital? I wanted to call the police, but what would I even say? That I was attacked by some kind of monster patient? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. So I went home, locked all the doors and windows, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those feral eyes staring back at me, heard that inhuman growl. As the sun rose, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to that hospital. I couldn't risk facing that thing again, or worse, finding out what might have happened to my coworkers. I called in and quit on the spot, found a new job in a different city. But no matter how far I run, I can't shake the memory of that night. The lingering fear that someday, somehow, that creature will find me again. Sometimes on stormy nights, I swear I can hear scratching at my window, see glowing eyes peering in from the darkness. But maybe that's just my imagination playing tricks on me. At least, that's what I tell myself to get through the night.